I found her car before I found her. My father's casket was still being lowered into the frozen earth when I noticed her silver Honda wasn't in the church parking lot, wasn't at the graveside, wasn't anywhere it was supposed to be. 300 people had shown up to bury Daniel Mercer. Colleagues, old friends, neighbors who'd known him since before I was born. And my wife of 6 years, Claire, was not among them. I had called her 4 times during the service, straight to voicemail. I had texted her 11 times. Nothing. And somewhere between the priest's final prayer and my uncle pressing a cold hand into mine and saying, "Your father would be proud," I stopped grieving and started calculating. I didn't cry at the graveside. I should have. My father deserved my tears. A man who had worked double shifts at the plant for 20 years so I could go to college, who had shown up to every single one of my baseball games even when his knees were shot, who had held my hand in the hospital 2 weeks ago and told me not to worry, that everything was going to be okay. He was the kind of man who still believed everything would be okay, even when he was dying. I had gotten his faith in people, honestly. Or I thought I had. My Aunt Patricia kept squeezing my arm and asking if I was all right. I kept nodding. My cousin Drew handed me a glass of something warm at the reception back at the family house, and I drank it without tasting it, my phone face up on the table beside the casseroles and sympathy cards, waiting for a message that didn't come. 6 years of marriage. She had known my father almost as long as I had known her. She had cried at our rehearsal dinner when he gave his toast. She had called him Dad without any hesitation, right from the start, and he had loved her for it. He had asked about her in the hospital the last week. "How's Claire holding up?" he'd asked, because even dying, Daniel Mercer worried about other people. At 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours after we'd put my father in the ground, I got a single text from Claire. "So sorry, something came up. Be home later tonight. How are you holding up?" I stared at that message for a long time. Something came up. On the day of my father's funeral, something came up, and it was more important than being beside me while I buried the man who had raised me alone after my mother left when I was 7. Something came up, and she couldn't even call to tell me what it was. "How are you holding up?" 7 words of concern delivered 3 hours late, via text, with a period at the end like a door closing. I typed back, "Where are you?" She didn't answer. I had met Claire Donovan at a mutual friend's housewarming party 8 years ago. She had been standing near the bookshelf arguing passionately about a novel I'd never read, and I had inserted myself into the conversation just to keep her talking. She was the kind of woman who made you want to be more interesting than you actually were. Dark hair, quick laugh, the sort of eyes that seemed genuinely lit from behind. I fell for her fast and completely, the way you do when you're 28 and you've been waiting for something to hit you that hard. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. I did it at the lake house where her family vacationed every summer, down on one knee at the end of the dock at sunset, the whole thing. She said yes before I'd finished the question. We had a good marriage. At least I thought we did. There were rough patches, money stress, my workload at the architecture firm, a period about 2 years in when she seemed distant and unhappy, and we did 6 months of couples counseling that I thought had fixed things. We came out of that stretch closer, or so I believed. She told me I was her best friend. I told her the same. I meant it absolutely, without reservation, the way you mean things when you don't yet understand that meaning them doesn't make them true for both people at once. My father's illness had put a strain on things. I'd been driving down to visit him 3 or 4 times a week for the past 4 months, spending nights at his house sometimes when he was having bad stretches. Claire had been supportive, she'd said. She'd said she understood. But looking back now, sitting at my dead father's reception with her text message on my screen, I began cataloging all the small things I had stored in a drawer in my mind and labeled nothing. The nights she came home late with vague explanations. The phone she started keeping face down on the counter. The way she'd started going to the gym at odd hours. The birthday of an old friend I'd never met that she'd mentioned twice in the past month. Both times slightly too casually. His name had come up before. Once, early in our relationship, she'd mentioned him in passing. Her first serious boyfriend from college. A guy named Derek. They'd dated for 2 years before she moved to the city. She said it ended mutually, said they'd outgrown each other. I hadn't worried about it. It was ancient history. It was nothing. It was what I put in the drawer and labeled nothing. I left my father's reception at 5 o'clock without telling anyone where I was going. Her location sharing was still turned on. We'd set it up 2 years ago when she was traveling for work, and I'd wanted to make sure she'd landed safely, and neither of us had ever turned it off. It was one of those small technological intimacies that accumulates in a marriage without discussion. I had never once checked it out of suspicion. I opened it now with hands that were perfectly, eerily steady, the same hands that had just helped lower my father's casket. And I watched the little blue dot that was Claire resolve itself onto a street across town. It was not our street. I knew the neighborhood. It was a nicer area than ours, the kind of streets with big oak trees and older homes that had been renovated carefully. I typed the address into my phone. A name came up on a catering events listing. Private birthday event, venue rental. And then I searched the name of the venue owner, and then I searched the birthday, and then, because the internet is a ruthless and indiscriminate thing, I found a public Instagram post from 2 days ago. A man named Derek Holt, turning 35, hosting a small gathering at his home for close friends. I drove there. I want to be precise about what I felt driving across town, because it matters. It wasn't rage yet. Rage came later, hot and loud. What I felt in that car was something closer to the ground, a cold and terrible clarity, the feeling of a floor giving way beneath you, and suddenly understanding the exact dimensions of the hole you've been standing over for years. My father was in the ground. My wife was at her first love's birthday party. I had buried my father 4 hours ago, and she hadn't come. She hadn't answered her phone. She had sent me a text that said something came up, and she was here. I parked on the street. The house was lit warmly from inside, and I could hear music through the front windows, low and easy, party music. There were a dozen cars in the driveway and along the curb. Her silver Honda was between a black truck and a blue sedan, and it was warm when I put my hand on the hood. She hadn't just arrived. She had been here a while. I walked up the front path and rang the doorbell. A woman I didn't know answered, holding a glass of wine, clearly surprised to find a man in a funeral suit on the doorstep. "Is the party in there?" I said. My voice was calm. She nodded, uncertain, and stepped back, and I walked in. It was a decent-sized living room full of people I didn't know. Nice rugs, good furniture, a long table of food along one wall, a bar set up in the corner. I scanned the room and didn't see her immediately, and then I did. She was in the kitchen doorway, laughing at something, her head tilted in that particular way she had when she was genuinely amused, the laugh I had fallen in love with 8 years ago. She was wearing a blue dress I didn't recognize, and her hair was down, and she looked more comfortable than I had seen her look in a long time. And standing next to her, one hand on the small of her back, was a man about our age, tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair going gray at the temples. His hand was on the small of her back. She didn't step away from it. She wasn't a stranger tolerating the contact of someone she barely knew. She was leaning into it. It was the body language of a person being touched by someone they have allowed to touch them before. "Claire." She heard her name and turned, and what happened to her face in that moment told me everything. Told me more than any evidence or confession or confrontation ever could have. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't the blank surprise of someone who has no idea why their husband is standing in a stranger's kitchen. What crossed her face was terror, the instant, reflexive terror of someone caught. And then, immediately after, on something that looked almost like resignation, like a person who has been waiting for something to finally arrive. The man beside her, Derek, I understood now, Derek Holt, 35 today, removed his hand from her back and took a careful step to the side. "Liam," she said, "what are you—" "My father's funeral was today," I said. The room had gone quiet around us. I was aware of people watching, aware of the music continuing absurdly in the background, some soft pop song utterly indifferent to the situation. "I buried my father today, Claire. 300 people were there. His neighbors were there. People he hadn't spoken to in 15 years were there. His doctor was there." I looked at her. "You weren't there." "Liam, please, not here." "Here is the only place available," I said. "Because here is where you are. I've been calling you since noon. It's almost 6 o'clock. You sent me one text." I looked at Derek, who was staring at his own floor with the expression of a man desperately wishing he were somewhere else. "Is this where you've been spending your time? When I've been at the hospital? When I've been sitting with my dying father? It's not— Don't tell me it's not what it looks like." My voice cracked on that, the first real crack, and I felt the heat rising now, felt the cold floor of the car giving way to something hotter and less controlled. "I know what it looks like because I know what I saw. His hand was on you. You didn't move away. You were laughing, Claire. You were laughing at this man's birthday party while I put my father in the ground." "Liam!" She stepped toward me, and I stepped back. "How long?" I asked. She went still. "Taunt, how long?" I said again. Around us, the room was frozen. 10 or 12 strangers witnessing something they hadn't signed up for. And I didn't care. I couldn't care. I needed to hear her say it. "8 months, she said finally, in a voice so small it barely reached me. 8 months. My father had been diagnosed 11 months ago. For nearly the entire duration of his illness, every drive to the hospital, every night sitting beside him, every conversation where he'd asked, "How's Claire holding up?" For almost all of that, she had been here, coming back to this man while I was sitting with my father. 8 months, I repeated, and I looked at Derek, who had the decency to look ashamed. "Did you know she was married?" He didn't answer. He looked at Claire. "Did you know she was married to someone whose father was dying?" I asked. "Liam, please," Claire said. "I'm not speaking to you right now." I turned back to Derek. "Did you know?" "Yes," he said. Quietly, but yes. At least he gave me that. I looked back at Claire. She was crying now, which was more than she had done for my father today. The tears seemed to infuriate me more than anything else, that she had saved them for this moment, for herself, after spending the day celebrating while I stood at a graveside. "I want you out of the house by the time I get back," I said. "I want your things in boxes. I want your key on the kitchen table." "Liam, we're done," I said. "We've been done, apparently, for 8 months. You just didn't tell me." I looked at her one more time. I had loved this woman completely. I had stood on a dock at sunset and asked her to spend her life with me, and she had said yes before I'd finished the question. My father had called her daughter. He had asked about her a week before he died. "I hope it was worth it," I said. "I genuinely hope whatever this was gave you something, because it cost you everything." I walked out of the party, and no one stopped me. I drove to my father's house, which still smelled like him, and I sat in his kitchen for 3 hours. His coffee mug was still in the drying rack. His reading glasses were still on the kitchen table next to a folded newspaper, the crossword half finished. He had been a man of routines and small pleasures, my father, and his house was full of evidence of them. The shelf of paperback westerns, the fishing rods in the garage, and the calendar on the wall with medical appointments crossed out in red pen. I sat among all of it, and I let myself cry, finally, which I hadn't been able to do at the graveside. I cried for him, and I cried for the marriage I'd thought I had, and I cried because somewhere in the mess of it all, I understood that I had been trusting two people absolutely, and I'd lost them both in the same day. My cousin Drew found me there around 9. He'd been calling. He came in with a six-pack and sat across from me at my father's kitchen table and didn't say anything for a while, which was exactly right. "Where was she?" he asked eventually. I told him. Drew was 38 and had been through a divorce himself, a bad one, and he listened without the kind of furious performance some men put on for solidarity. He just listened, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, what do you need?" That question, simple, practical, oriented entirely toward me, was the first thing that made me feel like I had solid ground beneath my feet. What did I need? I needed to survive the next weeks. I needed to handle my father's estate, which was modest but would require attention. I needed a lawyer. I realized, to be very careful about the next steps, because the rage I felt was enormous and clean, and I understood that it could either destroy me or be directed with precision at the things that deserved it. "A lawyer," I said. "I need to talk to a lawyer first thing tomorrow." Drew nodded. I know someone good." Claire had taken some of her things and left a note that said she was staying with her friend Jess, and that she was sorry and that she wanted to talk when I was ready. I folded the note without finishing it and put it in the kitchen drawer and called my father's lawyer to begin the estate process, and then I called a divorce attorney named Patricia Owens, who came highly recommended by Drew's contact, and I made an appointment for the following morning, and then I sat down with my laptop and I began to look at what 8 months of an affair actually looked like when you knew where to look. Our finances were joint. We had a shared account from which both of us drew freely, the remnant of a time when we'd trusted each other so completely that the idea of separate accounts had seemed almost insulting. I went through 6 months of statements in 2 hours. Restaurant charges, hotel charges, small ones, the kind that look like a business meal if you're not looking closely. A charge from a florist in March that I had never received flowers from. A charge from a jewelry boutique in February that I had never received jewelry from. Gifts he had given her, purchased with our shared money. I photographed every statement. I was methodical about it. This surprised me, how methodical I could be while simultaneously feeling like I was operating inside a low-frequency scream. I built a document. Dates, amounts, cross-referenced with her stated locations on those evenings. The nights she'd said she was working late. The weekends she'd claimed to be visiting her college friend Anna, who lived 2 hours away and who, I now realized, or had been unwittingly used as cover for this entire arrangement. I called Anna the next morning because Anna deserved to know her name had been used, and her reaction, genuine shock, genuine horror, an immediate and fierce loyalty to me that I hadn't expected, confirmed that she'd known nothing. "She told me she needed space to think," Anna said. "I had no idea this was what she was doing with that space. Liam, I'm so sorry. Your dad, God, I'm so sorry." She paused. "What can I do?" "Nothing yet," I said. "But thank you." Patricia Owens was a small, precise woman in her early 50s, with an office full of natural light and a manner that suggested she had heard everything and nothing surprised her anymore. She reviewed my documentation with the focused calm of a professional who had sat across from a lot of broken people and helped them put themselves back together, at least legally. She pointed out several things I would need to gather. She explained the process in terms I could follow. At the end of the meeting, she looked at me and said, You're handling this very clearly for someone in the middle of what you're in the middle of." "My father just died," I said. "I've already handled the most devastating thing. Everything else is just logistics." She nodded slowly. "That's a useful way to look at it." Claire texted me daily for the first week. They were long messages, apologetic, explanatory, reaching for understanding in the way people do when they've done something they can't undo, and they need the other person to provide them with some relief from their own guilt. I read each one fully, because I believed in being informed, and then I forwarded each one to Patricia Owens, and I did not respond. There was nothing she could have said in a text message that would have changed anything, and the act of responding would have given her the false impression that there was still a conversation to be had. The divorce papers arrived at her friend Jess's address by certified mail on a Thursday morning, 14 days after my father's funeral. She called me 3 times that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemails were the kind that make you feel something. Not because they change anything, but because you understand you are watching someone reckon with consequences, and even when consequences are entirely deserved, there is something sobering about it. I felt sad hearing them. I also felt clear. Clarity and sadness are not opposites. You can be both at once, and I was. What I had not anticipated was the professional dimension. Derek Holt, I discovered through the kind of motivated research that grief and fury enable, worked in commercial real estate development. He had a LinkedIn profile that was reasonably prominent. He was partners in a mid-size firm with a man named Gerald Whitmore, who was, it turned out, a fraternity brother of my colleague David Park at the architecture firm where I worked. David and I had collaborated on 3 projects. He was a decent man with a long memory and a very straightforward sense of right and wrong. I did not go to David specifically to damage Derek's professional standing. That is not entirely true. I went to David because I needed to tell someone who could understand the full geography of the situation. Not just a friend, but someone who occupied the same professional world and could contextualize the scope of the betrayal. I told him what had happened. I told him about the funeral. I told him about the 8 months. I told him about our shared account and the restaurant receipts and the florist. David was quiet for a long time after I finished. "Gerald needs to know his partner is this kind of person," he said finally. "Not as a question, as a statement." "I'm not asking you to do anything," I said. "I know," said David. "But Gerald needs to know." I don't know exactly what David said to Gerald Whitmore. I know that within 2 weeks, there were changes at Derek's firm. I know this not because I watched for it obsessively, but because mutual professional networks are small, and people talk, and what I heard through the ordinary flow of professional gossip was that Gerald Whitmore had become, abruptly, considerably less enthusiastic about his partnership, and had begun consulting lawyers about the firm's structure. Whether this was primarily about Derek's character or about some additional business concern I was not aware of, I couldn't say. What I could say was that I had told the truth to someone who found it relevant, and the truth had traveled as truth tends to do. What I had also not anticipated, and what landed with more force than anything professional, was Claire's mother. Diane Donovan had been a presence in my life for 6 years, a warm, slightly overbearing woman who had always treated me like a son, and who, I had assumed, would take her daughter's side through anything the way mothers often do. I had not contacted her. I had been focused on my own father's estate, on the divorce proceedings, on simply getting through each day without the twin weight of grief and betrayal flattening me entirely. But Diane contacted me. She left a voicemail on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks after the funeral. Her voice was small and ashamed, and it was clear she had been crying before she started recording. She had found out from Jess, apparently. She was calling to tell me that she was horrified, that she couldn't understand it, that she was sorry about my father, that she had always adored him, that she didn't know what to say to her daughter, and she didn't know what to say to me except that she knew which side of right and wrong she stood on. "Your father was a good man," she said on the voicemail. "And you are his son. I'm so sorry, Liam." I sat with that message for a long time. Then I called her back. We talked for an hour, two people who both loved someone who had chosen not to be who either of us believed she was, trying to understand the distance between the person we'd known and the person she'd turned out to be. It didn't resolve anything. It helped anyway. Claire, I was told through Anna, wasn't taking her mother's reaction well. She had imagined, I think, that the fallout would be contained, that she would move on with Derek, or that I would be hurt and angry and eventually move past it, that her family and social circle would take some time and then quietly recalibrate around the new reality. What she had not accounted for was the specific nature of the timing, that she had not been merely absent from our marriage, but absent from my father's funeral, and that this particular detail was the kind that travels. People who barely knew me, people who had heard secondhand about the divorce, people who had no particular stake in either of us, they all came back to that detail. The funeral. She wasn't there. That detail became the entire story, wherever it was told, because it was the story. It needed no editorializing. You didn't need to know anything about the 8 months, or the restaurant receipts, or Derek Holt's birthday party. And you just needed to know that she hadn't come. The story told itself, and it was devastating precisely because it was true. Within a month, her close friend group had fractured. Some people chose not to choose, which meant they disappeared from both our lives. But a majority of the people who had been friends with us as a couple, people I had been half convinced would drift naturally toward her side, chose me. Not with drama, not with ceremony. They just kept calling. They kept showing up. They invited me to things. They mentioned their anger, and then set it aside and focused on making sure I was okay, which was exactly what I needed. Derek and Claire's relationship, from what I heard in the months that followed, was not flourishing under the weight of how it had started. This is, I have learned, common. And the things that make an affair feel urgent and electric are often exactly the things that make the subsequent relationship brittle. The secrecy, the stolen time, the sense of choosing each other against obstacles, none of that translates once you're simply two people in an ordinary relationship trying to build something out of rubble. She had turned her entire life over for him. He was, by all accounts, not turning anything over for her. I heard this not because I sought it out, but because Anna stayed in touch, and Anna had a clear view of the situation and told me things she thought I should know. Not to wound me, but because she believed I deserved honesty. From her, I learned that Derek had not left anyone to be with Claire. He had simply been available, unattached, and willing, and that the version of this she had constructed in her mind, some great reclaimed love, a return to something she'd given up, was being quietly dismantled by the ordinary friction of his actual personality. I did not feel satisfaction hearing this. I want to be honest about that, because the satisfaction I expected to feel never arrived in the clean, complete form I'd imagined it. What I felt was something more muted and more dignified, a quiet recognition that the consequences were unfolding correctly, the way physics unfolds, without any need for my intervention or observation. I was busy with other things by then. My father's estate had required significant attention over the first 2 months. The house, the accounts, the modest pension, the 30 years of accumulated belongings that needed to be sorted with care. I had taken 2 weeks off work for this, and in the process of sorting through his things, I had found boxes I hadn't known existed. Letters, photographs, a journal he'd kept sporadically for years, which I read over 3 nights with a bourbon, and the kind of crying that doesn't feel like sadness exactly, but more like the release of pressure that has been building for months. He had written about me in it. He had written about my mother, not with bitterness, which surprised me, but with the measured understanding of someone who had made peace with a hard thing. He had written about being proud, which was, in the end, the thing he had always been most faithful about expressing, and which I had sometimes struggled to fully receive. I received it now. I let it land. The house I decided to keep. My father had paid it off years ago and left it to me, and rather than selling it immediately, I took my time. I spent weekends there, cleaning it slowly, making decisions about what to keep and what to give away. There was something clarifying about the work. Physical, concrete, bounded. By the end of a weekend, I could see exactly what I had done, and it was enough. I started running again. I had run in my 20s and dropped it somewhere in the middle of the marriage, replaced by the gym, and then by nothing much. I started slowly, 2 miles, then 3, and built it back up over the winter months until I was running 5 mornings a week in the gray pre-dawn, my father's neighborhood streets, then longer loops through the city. It did what running does when you need it to do something. It burned off the residue and the low-grade static of grief and anger and replaced it with a tiredness that was clean and earned. At work, the divorce was known but not dwelt upon, in the way professional environments handle personal catastrophe when the person involved continues to perform well and doesn't require management of their pain. I performed well. Not because I was repressing anything, but because my work, designing spaces for people to inhabit, thinking about light and proportion and the way a room makes you feel, had always been something I could disappear into productively, and disappearing into it productively was what I needed. I had a project that year that I was proud of, a community center in a neighborhood that had been waiting decades for decent public infrastructure. I stayed late on it. I cared about it. It kept me looking forward. The divorce was finalized 7 months after my father's funeral. Patricia Owens shook my hand and told me I had been an excellent client, by which she meant I had been organized and reasonable and had not made her job harder than it needed to be. I thanked her and walked out of her office into a cold spring afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the particular specific lightness of something enormous being completed. Not happiness, not yet. Happiness was further down the road, but a clean and particular lightness, the feeling of a weight that has been removed. I called Drew, who took me to dinner and ordered expensive things and made me laugh for the first time in months. Properly laugh, the kind that reaches your whole body. When his wife Ellen was there and she was warm and funny and kept refilling my glass and said things like, "You are so much better off," with such cheerful conviction that it was impossible not to believe her. "You know what's funny?" Drew said at some point in the evening. "Dad always said he liked Claire, but he didn't trust her laugh." I looked at him. "What?" "Your dad. He said to me once, years ago I want to say, at your wedding rehearsal. He said, 'She has a beautiful laugh, that girl, but it's not always real.'" I didn't know what to make of it at the time. Drew shrugged. He knew. My father had known, or sensed something, and had never said it to me. Which was exactly right, exactly like him, not wanting to plant a seed that might poison something unnecessarily, trusting me to find my own way. Even his reservations had been kind. I missed him so much in that moment it was like a hand around my throat. I took a breath. I took a drink. I looked at Drew and Ellen across the table and felt, for the first time in a long time, that I was surrounded by something real. I saw Claire once, in the months that followed. Not at any planned encounter, not at some dramatic final reckoning in a public place. Just in the parking lot of a grocery store on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, about 10 months after the funeral. I was coming out with 2 bags, and she was going in, and we both stopped for a moment, the way people do when there is too much history between them, for the ordinary rules of stranger navigation to apply. She looked tired. Not broken, not destroyed, not the ruined figure I had sometimes imagined in my angrier moments. Just tired and older, and smaller than she had looked at Derek's party, where she had been lit from inside by something I now understood was not really about me at all. She was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, which made sense. She was a different person's person now, in a different person's story. She looked like someone living with a decision they could not return. "Liam," she said. "Claire," I said. We looked at each other for a moment. There was nothing loud in me, nothing that needed saying. The rage had burned through its own fuel over the months, the way rage does when you don't keep feeding it. And what was left was not warmth. It wasn't forgiveness. I don't want to claim something I'm not sure I fully possess. But it was quiet. It was the quiet of someone who has been through something and come out the other side and has enough distance now to look at the whole shape of it. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your father, about everything. I'm sorry." "I know," I said. And I did know. I believed her. It didn't change anything. It didn't need to. I walked to my car and put the groceries in and drove to my father's house, which I had been slowly renovating over the past months, stripping walls back to original plaster, refinishing the hardwood floors, putting in a new kitchen. There is a satisfaction to renovation that I had not fully appreciated before. The exposure of what was underneath, the assessment of what can be saved, the deliberate decision to build something worthwhile in the space that's been cleared. The house was coming along. It was going to be good. When that evening I made dinner in the new kitchen, something my father had taught me years ago, a simple pasta with oil and garlic and whatever was in the refrigerator. I ate at his kitchen table, the one I'd sat at crying on the night of the funeral, the one with his crossword newspaper that I'd kept, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, folded exactly as he'd left it on a shelf in the other room. It was a good dinner. The house was quiet in the specific, comfortable way of houses that are being cared for. Outside, the March evening was going dark, the neighborhood settling into its rhythms. I thought about my father. Not with grief, or not only, also with something that approached gratitude for everything he had shown me about what it meant to be a person of actual substance, how to work, how to show up, how to be, in the precise and unglamorous way that matters, consistently and without performance. He had not been a complicated man, but he had been a true one, and in the year since losing him, I had come to understand that true was the most difficult thing to actually be, and the most valuable. I thought about the day I'd buried him, and what else had been buried with him. A version of my life I had believed in completely. A marriage I had trusted. A future I had been building toward. All of it in the ground on the same January day, and I had stood there, in the cold, in a funeral suit, surrounded by people who had loved my father, and I had not understood yet that losing those things would leave me with something better. Not right away, not easily, but eventually. Eventually, I was left with something real. I finished dinner and washed the dishes and put them in the rack where my father's mug still stood, which I had left there on purpose because I wasn't ready to move it and might never be. Outside, a dog was barking somewhere down the street. A car passed. The house made its small sounds. I was 34 years old and I was fine. I was more than fine. I was starting to understand what it meant to be free. Not the word on a bumper sticker, not the tidy resolution of a life that had wrapped itself up cleanly, but the actual experience of standing in your own life, in a house you are building with your own hands, eating dinner you made yourself, and feeling the ground solid beneath you. Feeling it hold. My phone buzzed. It was Drew, sending a photo, a fish he'd caught that weekend, enormous, or the kind of photo my father would have gotten a tremendous kick out of. I looked at it and laughed, really laughed, and sent back. Dad would have said that was a medium fish at best. Drew responded immediately with 3 crying, laughing emojis, and then he would have said you were using the wrong bait. He would have been completely right. I set the phone down and sat for another moment in my father's kitchen, in the quiet and the warmth and the good, solid fact of everything I had left. It was enough. It was, if anything, exactly enough. The kind of enough that only becomes visible after you've lost the things that were hiding it from you all along. I never stopped missing him, but I stopped being lost. That felt like the thing he would have wanted. His son, not lost, standing in the house he'd left him, knowing his own worth. Oh, building something. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. And I slept deeply, without dreaming, the way you sleep when you are finally, completely home.